Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she read the custody papers delivered at dawn. Her ex-husband David claimed she was an unfit mother, demanding emergency custody of 3-year-old Emma. It was a lie, a devastating lie that threatened to destroy everything. Sarah had devoted her life to raising Emma alone after David abandoned them 2 years ago. Now, suddenly, he wanted their daughter. The timing felt suspicious, deliberate. Sarah's attorney warned her the case was serious. With David's expensive lawyers and his seemingly perfect image, Sarah feared the worst. She held Emma close that night, whispering promises that she wouldn't lose her baby. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in October. Sarah had woken at 6 o'clock, the pale Portland sunlight filtering through the worn curtains of their small apartment. Emma was still sleeping, her curly hair splayed across her pillow, one tiny fist clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. Sarah stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her daughter breathe, feeling that familiar, overwhelming love mixed with constant worry. It was the love that kept her going through the exhausting double shifts at the hospital, the love that made her skip meals to ensure Emma had everything she needed, the love that consumed her every waking thought. She had gone downstairs to make coffee, planning to wake Emma in 20 minutes for their morning routine. They had a rhythm: breakfast together, then Emma to preschool, then Sarah to her nursing job at Portland General Hospital. It was a simple life, modest but filled with purpose. Sarah worked in the pediatric ward, caring for sick children, which meant she understood the weight of responsibility in ways most people couldn't fathom. She poured her heart into her work and into motherhood. The two roles were inseparable for her. The doorbell had rung at 6:47 a.m. Sarah remembered the time because she'd glanced at the clock, wondering who could possibly be visiting so early. Her stomach had clenched immediately. Nothing good ever came from unexpected visitors at dawn. When she opened the door, a woman in a gray suit stood holding an official-looking envelope. "Sarah Mitchell?" the woman asked, not bothering with pleasantries. Sarah's mouth had gone dry. She nodded mutely, and the woman thrust the papers into her hands. "You've been served," she said flatly, then turned and left. Sarah had sunk onto the bottom step of her apartment stairs, the papers falling from her shaking hands. The words blurred at first, then came into focus with sickening clarity. Emergency custody hearing, unfit mother, child welfare concerns, David Alexander Mitchell, petitioner seeking immediate custody. Her vision had swum. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. David, her ex-husband, the man who had walked out 2 years ago, who had missed Emma's 2nd and 3rd birthdays, who had ignored every child support notice, who had moved on with his new life and had shown absolutely no interest in his daughter, that David was now claiming she was an unfit mother. The irony was so twisted it almost felt like a cruel joke. She had called her attorney immediately, her voice shaking so badly she could barely speak. Attorney had listened with growing concern as Sarah recounted the papers. "This is aggressive," had said slowly. "Emergency custody hearings are rare. The burden of proof is high. I need to know, have there been any incidents, any concerns raised by Emma's preschool, her pediatrician, anyone?" "No," Sarah had whispered. "Emma is healthy, happy, thriving. Her preschool teacher says she's a joy to have in class. Her last pediatric checkup was perfect. I don't understand. I've done everything right." "I believe you," said, though Sarah could hear the worry threading through her words. "But David must have something. This isn't a random move. There has to be a catalyst. People don't just file for emergency custody without something prompting it." That was when Sarah's mind had begun spiraling. She'd gone upstairs and found Emma awake, sitting up in bed rubbing her eyes. Emma had reached for her mother with that complete, unconditional trust that only small children possess. Sarah had scooped her up and held her, breathing in the sweet toddler smell of her hair, feeling Emma's soft arms around her neck. "Good morning, baby," she'd whispered, trying to keep her voice steady, trying not to cry. "Mommy's sad?" Emma had asked, tilting her head to look at her mother's face with those impossibly bright blue eyes. Even at 3 years old, Emma was perceptive. reading emotions like other children her age read picture books. "Mommy's just tired, sweetie," Sarah had lied, hatting herself for it. "Come on, let's get breakfast." Throughout that day, Sarah had gone through the motions in a state of shock. She dressed Emma, fed her, taken her to preschool. The teachers had noticed nothing amiss. Emma had run off to play with the other children without a backward glance, completely oblivious to the earthquake that was about to shake her world. Sarah had sat in her car afterward, gripping the steering wheel, unable to make herself drive to the hospital. Instead, she'd called again. They discussed strategy. The hearing was scheduled for November 15th, just 2 weeks away. 2 weeks to gather evidence that she was a good mother, that she was providing for Emma, that there was absolutely no basis for David's claims. 2 weeks to figure out what he was planning and why he was doing this now after all this time. Sarah had finally driven to the hospital, where she'd spent 8 hours caring for children with pneumonia, broken bones, and infections. Ironically, it was easier to focus on other people's sick children than to confront the panic about her own. Her supervisor had mentioned that Sarah seemed distracted, but Sarah had blamed it on lack of sleep. That night, after putting Emma to bed, Sarah had sat on the couch with a laptop and had begun building her case. She'd pulled up Emma's medical records, her preschool evaluations, her vaccination records. She gathered photographs of them together, happy moments captured on her phone. She'd started a timeline of the life they'd built together, 2 versus 1, always sufficient, always filled with love. At midnight, she'd finally closed the laptop and gone to check on Emma one more time. Her daughter was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the battle ahead. Sarah had brushed a strand of hair from Emma's forehead and had whispered a prayer to a God she wasn't entirely sure was listening anymore. "I won't lose you," she'd promised her sleeping child. "Whatever David's playing at, whatever this is about, I won't let anyone take you from me. You're mine and I'm yours, and that's the only truth that matters." But even as she'd said it, doubt had crept in like fog rolling over the Portland hills. What if David had something concrete? What if, despite her certainty, despite her love, the system somehow sided with him? What if the man who had abandoned them both could somehow convince a judge that Sarah, who had sacrificed everything for Emma, was the unfit parent? Sarah had returned to her bedroom and had lain awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios she couldn't control. The Portland courthouse loomed like a prison as Sarah approached it on the morning of November 15th. The massive stone structure seemed to swallow hope itself, its gray facade reflecting the overcast Oregon sky. Sarah had dressed carefully in a navy blue dress, professional but not flashy, maternal but not dowdy. She'd researched extensively what judges wanted to see. Nothing about her appearance should distract from her character. Everything about her should scream, devoted mother. Attorney met her in the lobby, carrying a leather briefcase stuffed with documents. Was in her early 50s, sharp-eyed and methodical, with a reputation for fighting hard in custody cases. She'd reassured Sarah multiple times that they had a strong case. But now, looking at its tight jaw and the worry lines around her eyes, Sarah felt her confidence crumble. "You okay?" asked, studying Sarah's pale face. "I haven't slept properly in 2 weeks," Sarah admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see worst-case scenarios. What if he has something we don't know about? What if the judge believes him?" "Then we fight," said firmly. "But Sarah, I need you to understand something. David's attorneys are expensive, which means they've done their homework. There's always a reason for emergency custody filings. We need to be prepared for whatever they throw at us. Stay calm, no matter what they say. Judges notice emotional control." They climbed the courthouse steps, and Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd brought photographs of Emma, medical records, letters from Emma's preschool teacher praising her development, her own employment records showing consistent work history. She had documentation of every pediatric visit, every vaccination, every milestone. She had receipts showing she provided for Emma's needs. She had love, which surely had to count for something. Inside the courthouse, the hallways echoed with footsteps and muted conversations. Sarah's senses felt heightened, almost painful. The marble floors reflected fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh and sterile. Security guards stood at various checkpoints. Other people passed by, lawyers in sharp suits, anxious-looking individuals waiting for their own cases, some with children in tow. Sarah wondered if any of them were in similar situations, fighting to keep their children. Judge Henderson's courtroom was exactly what Sarah expected, imposing and cold. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, the judge's bench elevated like a throne. An American flag stood in one corner. The word truth was carved into the wooden panel above the judge's seat. Sarah wanted to believe in that word, wanted to trust that truth would prevail. But increasingly, she'd learned that truth was often less powerful than perception. That's when she saw him. David sat at the opposite table with two attorneys, a man and a woman, both wearing expressions of supreme confidence. David himself looked different from how Sarah remembered. He'd gained weight, his hair was slicked back, and he wore an expensive suit that screamed money. Money that should have been going to support Emma for the past 2 years. Money from where? Sarah had no idea, and that worried her more than anything. David didn't look at Sarah directly, but she felt his presence like a predator circling prey. She took her seat beside and tried to steady her breathing. Judge Henderson entered and everyone stood. She was a woman in her late 60s, with steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. Her expression was neutral, almost bored, as if this was just another case among hundreds. To her, Sarah realized it was. This was her job. She had no emotional investment in whether Sarah kept her daughter or lost her. The proceedings began. David's lead attorney, a tall man named Mitchell with a predatory smile, began laying out their case. His voice was smooth and practiced, designed to persuade. He spoke about Emma's welfare, about stability, about how David had established himself as a successful businessman and could provide a more stable environment than a single mother working double shifts. "Your Honor," said, his hands gesturing eloquently, "my client has become aware of concerning situations in his daughter's current living situation. A 3-year-old child should not be left in for 12 hours at a time while her mother works overnight shifts. This constitutes neglect, not out of malice perhaps, but through circumstance. My client is prepared to provide Emma with a full-time parent, a structured environment, and a lifestyle befitting the daughter of a successful businessman." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. Neglect. She'd arranged Emma's carefully, choosing a facility with excellent ratings and caring staff. Emma loved her teachers. The facility was nurturing and educational. Sarah had made countless sacrifices to provide for her daughter, and this man was twisting her devotion into negligence. Then introduced his witnesses. First came a man Sarah had never seen before, who that he'd observed Sarah looking frazzled and overwhelmed while dropping Emma at preschool. The preschool director, however, that Emma was thriving and emotionally secure. But had another witness, a woman who claimed to be a family friend of David's, who stated that she'd seen Sarah's apartment and it was cluttered and unsuitable for a young child. Objected repeatedly, but the damage was being done. Sarah felt the momentum shifting. Judge Henderson's expression remained neutral, but she was taking notes, and those notes felt like daggers. Then came David's testimony. He spoke eloquently about his desire to be involved in his daughter's life, about how he'd matured since leaving Sarah, about how he now understood his responsibilities as a father. He painted a picture of himself as a reformed man, ready to be present for his child in ways he hadn't been before. He never once acknowledged the 2 years of absence, the missed birthdays, the ignored child support obligations. When cross-examined him, David remained calm and collected. He had good answers. When asked about his absence, he claimed he'd been dealing with personal struggles but had overcome them. When asked about child support, he said he'd been unable to pay, but now he was in a position to provide abundantly. His lawyers had clearly coached him well. Finally, it was Sarah's turn to testify. She stood, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Questions were gentle, designed to elicit the emotional truth of her devotion. Sarah spoke about Emma, about her personality, her intelligence, her creativity. She spoke about the sacrifices she'd made, the love that drove every decision. She talked about Emma's medical care, her educational experiences, her emotional. But then cross-examined her and his tone changed. He became aggressive, insinuating that Sarah was negligent, that she was putting her career before her child, that she was unstable and over-emotional. He asked pointed questions about her finances, her work schedule, her social life. He suggested that she was using Emma to justify her lifestyle choices. "Isn't it true, Ms. Mitchell," he asked, his voice dripping with implication, "that you've struggled financially, that you've sometimes had to choose between bills and providing for your daughter?" "I've worked hard to provide everything Emma needs," Sarah said, her voice shaking with controlled anger. "I have never let my daughter go without." "But you've been struggling, haven't you? Isn't that why you're often tired? Isn't that why you sometimes seem overwhelmed?" Sarah wanted to scream. Yes, she was tired. Yes, she was struggling financially, because she was a single mother working in healthcare which paid decently but not extravagantly, because she'd chosen love and presence over wealth and leisure. But saying those things in this courtroom felt like admitting to failure. When Sarah stepped down, she felt utterly defeated. She'd meant to be composed and in control, but she'd felt her emotions bubbling up, threatening to crack her composure. She worried the judge had seen weakness instead of strength, uncertainty instead of dedication. Judge Henderson called a recess, and as Sarah sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, she felt something inside her breaking, squeezed her hand but offered no reassurances. There was nothing to reassure about. The testimony had been brutal, and the judge's expression had given nothing away. Sarah held Emma's photograph in her trembling hands and whispered a prayer she wasn't sure anyone was listening to anymore. The courtroom proceedings resumed after the lunch recess, and Sarah could feel the weight of defeat pressing down on her shoulders. She'd barely eaten, her stomach too twisted with anxiety to accept food. Had tried to be encouraging, saying they still had testimony from Sarah's employer and Emma's preschool teacher, but Sarah could see the concern etched into every line of her attorney's face. They were losing. Somehow, despite the truth being on their side, they were losing. Emma sat beside Sarah in the courtroom, coloring in a small activity book that the bailiff had provided. Sarah had explained to her daughter as simply as possible that they were at a special building and that Emma should be quiet and well-behaved. Emma, being 3 years old, understood only that her mother seemed scared, and that scared her too. The little girl sensed the tension the way animals sense an approaching storm, instinctively, without fully comprehending its source. As the afternoon proceedings commenced, Sarah's employer was called to testify. The head nurse at Portland General Hospital spoke eloquently about Sarah's work ethic, her reliability, and her dedication. "Sarah is one of our most conscientious employees. She's compassionate, professional, and she rarely misses work. When she does miss work for family reasons, it's always been legitimate issues. She's an exemplary nurse, and from what I've observed, an excellent mother who balances her responsibilities admirably." It should have helped. It should have provided some counterweight to David's accusations. But Sarah noticed Judge Henderson taking minimal notes, her expression remaining stubbornly neutral. The judge seemed unmoved by evidence of Sarah's character and competence. Then came Emma's preschool teacher, Miss Roberts, a warm woman in her 30s who Emma loved dearly. Miss Roberts about Emma's emotional security, her academic progress, her social development. "Emma is a joy," Miss Roberts said warmly. "She's confident, curious, and clearly loved by her mother. I've never seen any signs of neglect or emotional disturbance. Quite the opposite. She's one of the most secure and well-adjusted children in our program." This should have been the turning point. This was objective professional observation. But as David's attorney cross-examined Miss Roberts, he subtly planted doubt. He suggested that preschool teachers often only saw children during their best hours, and couldn't possibly know what happened when the child was at home. He implied that Emma might be performing well academically while suffering emotionally. He suggested that preschool teachers were trained to be positive and might not recognize genuine problems. Each insinuation was a small poison being dripped into the judge's mind. Throughout this testimony, Emma had been coloring quietly, but Sarah noticed her daughter becoming increasingly restless. Emma's small feet swung beneath the chair, not quite touching the ground. She began humming softly, something she did when anxious. Sarah gently squeezed her hand, and Emma looked up at her mother with worried eyes. "You okay, baby?" Sarah whispered. Emma nodded, but Sarah could see the tension in her small shoulders. The 3-year-old was absorbing the anxiety in the room like a sponge, though she had no framework to understand what was happening or why everyone seemed so angry and serious. As the afternoon wore on, the courtroom seemed to grow colder and more hostile. Judge Henderson's questions became increasingly pointed toward Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, you work overnight shifts." "3 nights a week," Sarah confirmed. "And your daughter is in during those times?" "Yes, with a professional facility that provides excellent care. But she's being raised primarily by strangers while you work." Sarah's throat tightened at the word strangers. They weren't strangers to Emma. They were caring professionals. But the way the judge said it made it sound like neglect. "She's being cared for by trained providers while I work to support us," Sarah said carefully, but she could hear the defensiveness in her own voice. That's when Emma started to cry. It began quietly, just a whimper, almost inaudible. Sarah immediately put her arm around her daughter, trying to comfort her. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered. "We're almost done." But Emma wasn't okay. The child was overwhelmed. She'd been sitting still for hours in an unfamiliar, formal environment. She'd sensed her mother's terror. She'd heard hostile voices and seen angry faces directed at the person she loved most in the world. For a 3-year-old, the emotional intelligence to process all this simply didn't exist. All Emma knew was that something was very, very wrong. "Mommy," Emma whimpered, her voice small and frightened. "Mommy, I scared." "I know, baby. Just a little longer," Sarah said, but her own voice cracked with emotion. Judge Henderson frowned from the bench. "Counsel, control your client's child. We need to continue." The judge's sharp tone made Emma cry harder. The formal reprimand, directed at Sarah, felt like a physical blow. The judge was making it seem as though Sarah couldn't even control her daughter, couldn't manage basic parenting even in this structured environment. It was a perception problem of the worst kind. Sarah tried desperately to soothe Emma, offering her juice, offering her the activity book, whispering reassurances. But Emma's distress escalated rather than diminished. The little girl's body shook with sobs she couldn't articulate. She didn't understand why everyone was being mean to Mommy. She didn't understand why her mother looked so scared. She didn't understand this cold, formal place with its hard chairs and serious faces. "I want to go home," Emma cried, her voice rising in pitch. "I want to go home with Mommy." "We will, sweetheart," Sarah said, tears now streaming down her own face. She was losing composure, the one thing had explicitly told her not to do. The judge wanted her calm, controlled, in command. Instead, Sarah was crying and her daughter was crying, and the entire courtroom was witnessing what David's attorneys would undoubtedly characterize as maternal instability. David's lead attorney leaned over and whispered something to his co-counsel. They both smiled, small, predatory smiles that made Sarah's blood run cold. They were winning. Her desperation was their victory. Emma's crying became almost inconsolable. The little girl was hyperventilating, her small body racked with sobs she couldn't control. "Mommy's sad. Mommy's sad," Emma kept repeating, as if by acknowledging her mother's distress she could somehow fix it. Judge Henderson's patience evaporated. "Ms. Mitchell, take your daughter outside if she cannot remain quiet." "But Your Honor," started to object. "Outside, now," Judge Henderson said coldly. Sarah had no choice. She scooped Emma into her arms and fled the courtroom, her daughter's sobs echoing off the marble walls of the courthouse hallway. She found a bathroom and locked herself in a stall with Emma, holding her trembling daughter, both of them crying now with the kind of despair that comes from feeling utterly powerless. Sarah sat on the bathroom floor, Emma in her lap, and whispered desperate assurances that she didn't believe. "It's going to be okay. I promise it's going to be okay. I won't let anything happen to you. You're my baby. You're mine." But even as she said it, doubt gnawed at her. She'd just proven, in front of a judge, that she couldn't keep her daughter calm under stress. She just demonstrated that Emma was emotionally unstable in her care. She'd just given David's attorneys exactly the ammunition they needed to paint her as an unfit mother. When she finally returned to the courtroom with a still sniffling Emma, the damage was irreversible. Judge Henderson looked at Sarah with something that might have been pity or might have been disgust. It was impossible to tell, squeezed Sarah's hand but said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The rest of the testimony passed in a blur. Sarah went through the motions, but she was no longer truly present. A part of her had already accepted defeat. A part of her was already preparing to say goodbye to Emma. That's when Officer James Torres walked into the courtroom with his German Shepherd, Max, and everything changed. Officer James Torres had been observing the entire proceeding from the back of Judge Henderson's courtroom. He stood quietly beside his partner, a magnificent German Shepherd named Max, a 4-year-old dog with a sleek black and tan coat and intelligent amber eyes. Torres was in his early 40s, weathered by years of law enforcement, but his face held a gentleness that came from years of working with traumatized people and distressed animals. He'd brought Max to the courthouse as part of a new wellness program, a compassionate initiative designed to help calm anxious witnesses and distressed children during proceedings. Torres had been watching Sarah throughout the morning and afternoon. He'd observed her careful composure, her desperate attempts to present herself as a fit mother. He'd seen the way she'd held Emma's hand, the tenderness in every gesture. He'd watched David and his expensive attorneys systematically dismantle her testimony with rhetorical tricks and insinuation. And he'd seen the moment Sarah's defenses had begun to crumble. When Emma started crying, Torres felt something shift in his chest. He'd worked with children enough to recognize genuine distress. This wasn't a tantrum. This was a child overwhelmed by an environment she couldn't comprehend, responding to her mother's fear with her own primal terror. Torres had seen Max respond to emotional distress before. The dog had an almost supernatural ability to sense when someone needed comfort, and he had the training and temperament to provide it without being intrusive. Torres leaned down and spoke quietly to Max, his hand resting on the dog's muscular shoulder. "Easy, boy. We might be needed soon." Max's ears perked up, his tail wagging slowly. The dog seemed to understand that his work might be beginning. When Sarah had fled the courtroom with Emma, Torres made a decision. He didn't ask for permission from his supervisor or consult the courthouse administrators. He simply waited, watching the door through which Sarah had disappeared. He knew what would happen when they returned. More testimony, more pressure, more mounting despair. A child couldn't withstand this level of stress indefinitely. Emma would eventually break down again, and when she did, the judge would use it against Sarah. But Max could help. Torres knew this with absolute certainty. When Sarah returned with Emma, the little girl was trying valiantly to be brave, but Torres could see the fragility in her. Her eyes were red and swollen. Her small body was rigid with the effort of holding herself together. She was a pressure cooker about to explode. The testimony resumed, but it was different now. Emma wasn't coloring anymore. She was simply sitting, frozen in place, her small hands gripping her mother's arm with desperation. Every sound made her flinch. Every word from the judge made her tense. Torres watched carefully, timing his moment. When Emma began to whimper again, when her body started shaking with the effort of suppressing fresh tears, when it became obvious that another complete breakdown was imminent, Tors moved into action. He approached the judge's bench with Max walking perfectly at his side, the dog's training evident in every movement. Max walked with his head up, alert but calm, his behavior exemplary. Tors cleared his throat respectfully, and Judge Henderson glanced down at him with mild irritation at the interruption. "Your Honor," Tors said quietly but with quiet authority, "I'm Officer James Tors with the Portland Police Department. I have Max here as part of the courthouse wellness program for distressed individuals. I believe the child might benefit from a brief interaction with the dog. It's been shown to significantly reduce anxiety in young children. With your permission, it might allow the proceedings to continue more smoothly." Judge Henderson started to refuse. Tors could see it in her expression. She didn't want this disruption, didn't want anything to complicate her already contentious case. But then she looked at Emma, who was trembling visibly now on the precipice of another breakdown. The judge sighed, clearly exhausted by the entire situation. "Fine," she said curtly, "but make it brief. We have much more testimony to get through." Tors nodded gratefully and approached Sarah and Emma. He moved slowly, deliberately, not wanting to startle the already frightened child. Sarah looked up at him with desperate hope and confusion. She had no idea what was about to happen, but any intervention felt like a lifeline. "Hi there," Tors said softly, kneeling down so he was at Emma's eye level. Max stood perfectly still beside him, his tail moving in a gentle, welcoming wag. "My name is Officer Tors, and this is my best friend, Max. Max is a very special dog who likes to listen to people when they're sad. Would you like to pet Max?" Emma stared at the dog with wide eyes. Her lip trembled. She looked at her mother, seeking permission. Sarah nodded encouragingly, and slowly, with the caution of a child who'd already experienced too much fear, Emma reached out her tiny hand. The moment Emma's fingers touched Max's fur, something profound shifted in the courtroom. The soft black and tan coat was warm and silky beneath her touch. Max turned his head slightly and gently licked her hand once, his movements infinitely gentle and calibrated perfectly for a frightened 3-year-old. The dog didn't jump. He didn't bark. He didn't do anything sudden or threatening. He simply stood there, warm and solid and present, a living comfort in this cold, hostile space. Emma's breathing began to slow. Her crying stopped. She continued petting Max, her small fingers moving across the dog's shoulder, her touch becoming more confident. Max's tail wagged slightly, as if pleased to be of service. Tors stayed close, providing quiet commentary. "Max really likes you," he said softly. "He can tell you're brave. He can tell you're special." He was speaking as much to calm Emma as to acknowledge the connection forming between the child and the dog. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, not tears of despair this time, but of gratitude. She watched her daughter relax for the first time that day. Emma was still in danger of losing her mother, still in the middle of a courtroom nightmare, but in this moment she had found solace. She had found comfort, and that small mercy was somehow keeping them both from drowning. The entire courtroom had gone quiet. Even David's attorneys had stopped their whispered consultation. Judge Henderson was watching the interaction with something that might have been surprise. The bailiff had lowered his newspaper. The court reporter's fingers had stilled over her keyboard. Everyone was witnessing something unexpectedly human in this otherwise cold, formal proceeding. Tors continued speaking to Emma softly, asking her about Max, drawing out small responses from the frightened child. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked gently. "Emma," she whispered, her hand never stopping its motion across Max's fur. "Emma is a beautiful name," Tors said warmly. "Max thinks so too. Would you like to know a secret about Max?" Emma nodded, her eyes still fixed on the dog. "Max has magic powers," Tors said, and Sarah could see him making something shift in the air between them. "He can make sad things feel a little bit better. Not make them go away, but make them feel more manageable." Emma seemed to absorb this, nodding seriously. She was still petting Max, and with each stroke of the dog's coat, she was regaining some equilibrium. Her breathing was normal now. Her body was no longer rigid with tension. But Tors had noticed something else during this interaction, something that would change everything. As Emma had leaned closer to Max, petting his face, she'd looked directly into the dog's eyes, and in that moment her expression had shifted. A flicker of recognition had crossed her small face. She titled her head, studying Max with sudden intensity. Tors had seen that look before. He knew what it meant. Emma had recognized something about this dog. Not the dog's face necessarily, but something about it was familiar to her. Tors made a mental note to investigate this further. But for now, he simply allowed Emma and Max to exist in this moment of peace. For the first time since arriving at the courthouse that morning, the little girl was calm. Her mother was calm, and the courtroom had returned to a state where the proceedings could continue. But Tors' mind was already working, already making connections, already wondering why a 3-year-old child would recognize a police dog named Max. The answer to that question, he suspected, would be far more important than anyone in this courtroom currently realized. Judge Henderson cleared her throat. "Thank you, Officer Tors, that seems to have helped. We can resume now." Tors nodded and guided Max back to the rear of the courtroom. But he remained alert, watching, observing, waiting for the moment when Emma would point at Max again and speak those 2 words that would shatter everything David had carefully constructed. He didn't have to wait very long. The courtroom had resumed its proceedings with a fragile sense of normalcy. Emma remained calm, her small hand occasionally reaching out to stroke Max's fur as the dog sat quietly beside Officer Tors at the back of the room. The dog's presence seemed to have created an invisible barrier of peace around the child, a temporary sanctuary in an otherwise hostile environment. Sarah felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. At least Emma was no longer in active distress. At least her daughter had found some comfort. Judge Henderson had called Sarah's final witness, a child psychologist Sarah's attorney had hired to testify about Emma's emotional development and security. The psychologist, Dr. Michael, was speaking about Emma's emotional resilience and bonding with her mother when something extraordinary happened. Emma's eyes had been tracking Max around the courtroom, watching the dog's every movement with rapt attention. Then, as the psychologist was describing Emma's secure attachment to her primary caregiver, Emma's body went suddenly rigid. Her small head tilted. Her eyes narrowed with the intensity of recognition. It was the same look Tors had noticed earlier, but stronger now, more urgent. Sarah felt her daughter tense beside her. "Emma, what's wrong, baby?" she whispered. Emma didn't answer. Instead, she stood up, her small body moving with surprising determination. She pointed directly at Officer Tors and Max with her arm fully extended, her finger trembling with the intensity of her focus. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward the back, where Tors stood with the dog. Sarah's attorney started to say something but silenced her with a raised hand. Something was happening. Something was about to shift. Emma opened her mouth and spoke 2 words with the clarity and certainty that only a child possessed, words that seemed to come from some deep, primal memory buried in her 3-year-old consciousness. "Daddy's friend." The courtroom exploded into silence. Not peaceful silence, but the kind of stunned, shocked silence that comes when something incomprehensible has just been uttered. Judge Henderson's pen stopped moving. David's attorneys froze mid-conversation. The court reporter's fingers stilled over her keyboard. Every single person in the room seemed to hold their breath simultaneously. David's face drained of all color. He went pale, not the pale of embarrassment or guilt, but the devastating pale of someone whose secret had just been exposed. His hands clenched into fists on the table in front of him. His attorney turned to him with alarm, but David couldn't respond. He was staring at Emma with an expression that was pure panic. Sarah didn't understand. She looked at her daughter with confusion and concern. "Emma, what do you mean? What's Daddy's friend?" But Emma was pointing still insistent, her small voice firm. Max Daddy's friend." Officer Tor's entire body had gone alert. Sarah saw his hand move to Max's collar, and she saw his eyes lock onto David with sudden, crystalline focus. It was the look of a police officer who had just realized something profound. Tor's jaw tightened. His free hand moved to his radio. Judge Henderson recovered first, her stern expression morphing into something far more complex, confusion mixed with the dawning realization that something significant was occurring in her courtroom. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded. "Officer Tors, do you have information relevant to this proceeding?" Tors stepped forward, his movements controlled but purposeful. His eyes never left David. "Your Honor, I need to speak with you privately, immediately. This child may have just identified information critical to an ongoing investigation." "Ongoing investigation," Judge Henderson repeated, clearly bewildered. "Of what?" "I can't discuss details in open court, Your Honor, but I believe this case needs to be recessed immediately." David suddenly stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "This is some kind of manipulation. That dog has nothing to do with me. That child is obviously confused, coached." "Sit down," Judge Henderson commanded, her voice cutting through his protest like a blade. "Sit down now." David sat, but his hands were shaking. Sarah watched him with growing horror and confusion. What was happening? What did Emma mean? How could a dog be Daddy's friend? The courtroom was buzzing with whispered questions, anxiety, and confusion. Tors approached the judge's bench and spoke in low, urgent tones that no one else could hear. Judge Henderson's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. Her eyes moved from Tors to David, and Sarah saw something like disgust cross her features. The judge picked up her telephone and spoke briefly to someone. Within moments, 2 uniformed officers entered the courtroom from the back entrance, their hands resting on their duty belts. Judge Henderson banged her gavel. "This proceeding is recessed indefinitely. Bailiff, I need Officer Tors in my chambers immediately, and someone needs to bring that child." "I'll take her," Sarah said quickly, standing and gathering Emma into her arms. But Judge Henderson held up a hand. "No, the child will be interviewed separately by trained personnel. Officer Tors make the arrangements." "Your Honor," protested, "this is highly irregular. My client should have access to her daughter." "Your client's daughter may have witnessed something critical," Judge Henderson said firmly. "I'm making that determination based on the officer's indication. Officer Tors, proceed." Tors approached Sarah with Max. He spoke quietly, his voice gentle despite the chaos that was now erupting around them. "Ms. Mitchell, I need to ask your daughter some questions. They'll be recorded. You and your attorney can observe, but I need to speak with Emma alone in a neutral environment. What she just said," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "it suggests she may have witnessed something important." "Witnessed what?" Sarah asked, her voice rising. "What are you talking about? What is Daddy's friend? What does Max have to do with David?" "That's what we're going to find out," Tors said grimly. Officers approached David and asked him to stand. But his face was a mask of pure terror. "This is insane," he was muttering. "This is completely insane. She's 3 years old. She doesn't know what she's saying. She's confused." "You have the right to remain silent," one of the officers said, and Sarah realized with shock that David was being read his Miranda rights. Her ex-husband was being arrested, right here, right now, in the courtroom. Sarah's mind couldn't process what was happening. Everything was moving in fast forward. Officers escorting David away. Judge Henderson disappearing into her chambers with Tors. A gentle female officer approaching Sarah and explaining that Emma needed to be interviewed by specialists trained in child testimony. Sarah held Emma tightly, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "It's okay, baby. It's okay," she whispered, though she had no idea if this was true. Emma looked up at her mother with those impossibly bright blue eyes. "Max is good dog, Mommy. Max helped." And in that moment, Sarah understood that something had shifted. Everything had changed. The trajectory of the case, the narrative David had so carefully constructed, the power dynamics in the courtroom, all of it had been obliterated by two simple words from a 3-year-old's mouth. Gripped Sarah's arm. "Something very significant just happened," she said quietly. "I don't know what yet, but David just went from orchestrating a custody battle to being arrested. That doesn't happen in a vacuum. That child knows something." Sarah watched as Emma was gently led away by the female officer, the child looking back at her mother with trust, not fear. And Sarah realized that somehow, in the most unexpected way possible, her daughter had just saved her. The question now was, what had Emma witnessed? What connection existed between David and this dog? And what criminal activity was about to be exposed? The courtroom door closed behind them, and Sarah was left in the hallway, stunned, grateful, terrified, and completely uncertain about what came next. But one thing was certain, everything had changed. Officer James Torres sat across from Emma in a specially designed interview room at the Portland Police Department. The space was intentionally non-threatening, soft pastel walls, comfortable furniture scaled to a child's size, toys and books arranged to make a 3-year-old feel safe. A camera mounted in the corner recorded everything, and behind a one-way mirror, Sarah and her attorney watched alongside a child psychologist trained in interviewing young witnesses. Torres spoke gently, his voice careful and measured. "Emma, do you remember the big dog in the courtroom, the dog named Max?" Emma nodded solemnly. She had a juice box in her small hand and a teddy bear on her lap, comfort items provided to help her relax during the interview. "That's good," Torres said encouragingly. "I need to ask you about Daddy. Have you seen Max before today at the courtroom?" Emma's head bobbed up and down. Daddy place." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Behind the one-way glass, she felt hand squeeze her shoulder. "Tell me about Daddy's place," Torres said, his voice remaining gentle. "What did you see there?" Emma's face scrunched in concentration, the way small children's faces do when they're trying to remember something. "Dogs," she said. "Lots and lots of dogs. Bad place. Scary place." Torres' jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Can you tell me more about the dogs, Emma? What did they look like?" "Hurt," Emma said simply, and the word hung in the air like a small bomb. "Dogs were hurt. They cry. Daddy and big men's yell at dogs." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. She'd had no idea. When had David taken Emma to this place? What had her daughter witnessed? Torres continued the interview, extracting details carefully. Emma described seeing dogs in cages. She described hearing loud noises. She described seeing men with stick things and hearing dogs yelping. She described Max specifically, describing the dog's markings and distinctive features with the clarity that only direct observation could provide. "Did you hear the men call Max anything?" Torres asked. "Did they give Max a different name?" Emma thought hard, her 3-year-old brain working to retrieve the memory. "Rip," she finally said. "They call Max Rip, Daddy's friend Rip." Torres' face went absolutely still. Behind the one-way glass, Sarah heard gasp softly. 2 hours later, Torres was briefing a task force of federal agents, local police, and animal welfare investigators. The evidence was damning. A 3-year-old child's testimony had identified a dog that had been stolen from a federal investigation 6 months ago. The dog's name was indeed Rip, a protection dog trained for an underground dog-fighting ring. Max, who was currently registered as a police dog trained by Torres, had actually been seized during a preliminary raid of the facility. Torres had been fostering Max temporarily while paperwork was processed, which was why the dog bore the police department name. That paperwork, investigators discovered, had been deliberately delayed. Someone had interfered with the chain of custody documentation. Someone had wanted that dog to disappear. As the investigation unfolded over the next 72 hours, the full scope of David's criminal enterprise became apparent. Federal agents, armed with Emma's testimony and new evidence, obtained warrants for multiple locations. What they found was staggering. David Mitchell's primary residence contained sophisticated records, meticulously detailed documentation of a dogfighting operation that had been running for over 2 years. The operation was structured like a business, with detailed accounts of training, matches, betting pools, and financial transactions. There were photographs, videos, and financial records showing money flowing in and out of offshore accounts. But the residence was merely the administrative center. The real horror was discovered at the facility Emma had described, a remote property 20 miles outside Portland, hidden by dense forest and accessed by private roads. Federal agents and animal welfare specialists discovered a nightmare. 23 dogs were found in the facility, all in varying states of distress and injury. Some bore fresh battle scars. Others had healed wounds indicating repeated fighting. The conditions were inhumane, cages too small for the animals, inadequate food and water, no veterinary care. A forensic veterinarian would later testify that several dogs bore injuries consistent with dog-fighting activity. The facility itself was equipped with a fighting pit, an octagonal arena specifically designed for dog combat. Blood stains marked the floor. Betting boards were scrawled on the walls with names and amounts wagered. A video surveillance system had captured dozens of fights, each one meticulously recorded for remote viewers who paid significant fees to watch combat. But that wasn't the most shocking discovery. Investigation of David's financial records revealed connections to organized crime figures involved in illegal gambling operations. The dogfighting ring wasn't just an isolated criminal enterprise. It was part of a larger network. Gambling debts associated with the dog fights had connected David to dangerous people who didn't tolerate debt or betrayal. Phone records showed dozens of calls between David and known associates of organized crime syndicates. Federal agents discovered that David had been planning to disappear. Travel documents had been prepared, false passports, visas for Mexico and Brazil, airline tickets scheduled for departure in 3 days. Investigators found $150,000 in cash hidden in David's bedroom closet, prepared for travel. And there were communications indicating that David had intended to take Emma with him, not out of paternal love, but as leverage. Intercepted messages showed David discussing his plan to use the kid as cover and to establish himself in Central America under an assumed identity. The custody battle, investigators concluded, had been orchestrated specifically to facilitate David's escape plan. By gaining custody of Emma, David would have a legitimate reason to relocate with her. He could disappear into a new country with his daughter as cover. A father traveling with his child would raise fewer red flags than a man fleeing alone. Emma's innocent presence at the facility 6 months earlier, a visit that had lasted perhaps an hour while David had met with associates, had been the thread that, when pulled by that 3-year-old's remarkable memory, unraveled his entire operation. As interrogation of David progressed, federal agents discovered even more disturbing details. David had been involved in the operation since its inception. He had recruited dogs from shelters and private breeders, falsely claiming he was training them for legitimate purposes. He had trained the dogs using abusive methods. He had orchestrated fights and coordinated gambling. He had maintained the facility. He had managed the finances. And he had been planning to expand, to establish additional fighting rings in other states, to increase the betting networks, to involve Emma in the business as she grew older, teaching her to participate in the criminal enterprise that consumed his life. When confronted with the evidence, particularly Emma's video testimony, David finally broke. He confessed to everything: 2 years of animal cruelty, organized gambling, money laundering, interstate commerce in fighting animals, and conspiracy with organized crime figures. He confessed to the custody battle being a smokescreen for his escape plan. He confessed to intending to use his own daughter as cover for his criminal flight. The confession led to additional arrests. 7 other individuals connected to the operation were detained. Organized crime investigators were able to follow the financial threads to identify additional participants in the larger gambling and animal abuse network. But none of it would have happened without Emma's simple observation, without a 3-year-old's remarkable memory for detail, without Officer Torres recognizing the significance of a child's innocent identification. As prosecutors prepared their case, they knew they had something remarkable. They had physical evidence, financial records, video documentation, expert testimony from veterinarians, and most powerful of all, they had Emma's testimony, innocent, truthful, devastating in its simple clarity. The courtroom that had nearly taken Emma away from her mother had instead become the catalyst for dismantling a criminal operation and saving 23 suffering animals. Justice, it seemed, sometimes arrived in the most unexpected packages. Sarah sat in a private interview room at the Portland Police Department, her hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Across from her sat Detective Maria, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the weathered appearance of someone who had spent decades working in law enforcement. Beside her was Dr., a child psychologist specializing in trauma and testimony. "I need you to understand something," Detective began carefully, "before we go through the details. What we've discovered about your ex-husband's activities is extensive and deeply disturbing. Some of what I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear, especially in relation to your daughter. But you need to know the truth." Sarah nodded, her throat tight with anticipation and dread. She'd been waiting for hours while Emma was being interviewed, while investigators gathered evidence, while her entire world was being turned inside out. The custody battle seemed laughably small now, insignificant compared to whatever had prompted David's arrest. "6 months ago," Detective began, "your ex-husband took your daughter to a facility located approximately 20 miles outside Portland. The facility, which David owned through shell corporations, was being used as the operational center for an illegal dog-fighting ring." Sarah's coffee cup fell from her hands, shattering on the floor. "What? No, that's not. Emma was at preschool. David doesn't have." She couldn't finish her sentences. Her mind couldn't process what she was hearing. "We know this must be shocking," Doctor said gently. "Emma has provided detailed descriptions of the facility, the dogs, and the people present. We have physical evidence confirming her account." "She was there for approximately 1 hour," Detective continued. "David brought her to meet with some of his associates. It was, apparently, supposed to be a brief introduction. Emma was given toys to play with while the men conducted business. She wasn't harmed during this visit, and David supervised her closely. But during that hour, Emma was exposed to the facility's operations." Sarah felt her entire body shaking. Why would he do that? Why would he ever take her there? "We believe David was showing Emma off," Detective said carefully, "introducing her to his associates as a way of establishing his place in the organization. It's not uncommon for criminals to do this, using family members to signal trust or commitment to their organization." The implication hung in the air. David had been planning to involve Emma in this criminal world from the beginning. He had been grooming her, preparing her for a life immersed in his criminal enterprises. "That's not all," Detective continued. "We've discovered that David's primary motivation for pursuing emergency custody was not genuine paternal interest. It was an escape plan. We found documentation indicating David was preparing to flee the country. He had arranged false passports, booked flights, and prepared significant amounts of cash. He was going to take her," Sarah whispered, understanding dawning like a horror. "He was going to take Emma with him." "Yes," Detective confirmed. "By gaining custody of you through the court system, David would have had the legal right to remove Emma from the country. She would have served as cover for his flight. A father traveling with his daughter appears less suspicious than a man fleeing alone. Our organized crime task force believes David was fleeing because of escalating pressure from his associates regarding missing funds. Sarah stood up suddenly, overwhelmed by the need to move to do something. She paced the small room, her hands clenched into fists. How much of this did Emma see? Did she understand what was happening? A 3-year-old's comprehension is limited, Doctor explained. Emma saw dogs. She heard loud noises and angry voices. She sensed that something was wrong or frightening, but she didn't have the cognitive framework to understand dog fighting, gambling, or criminal activity. What she did retain was sensory memory, the appearance of the dogs, the sound of the environment, specific people and their behaviors. And that's what helped identify David's operation, Detective added. When Emma saw Max in the courtroom, she recognized the dog from the facility. She identified it as Daddy's friend because that's how the men at the facility had referred to the dog, as David's special dog, his friend, the dog he was most proud of. We've identified 23 dogs at the facility, Detective continued, her voice heavy with the weight of what she was about to reveal. All were either stolen from shelters, taken in through false adoptions, or bred specifically for fighting purposes. Several had been used in active fights. The injuries ranged from minor to severe. 2 dogs were so seriously injured that they required emergency veterinary euthanasia due to untreatable conditions. Sarah felt bile rise in her throat. She dedicated her career to healing children, to relieving suffering. Learning that David had deliberately inflicted suffering on animals, that he'd brought their daughter into an environment of animal torture, that he'd planned to use Emma as an accessory to his criminal escape. It was overwhelming. There's more, Detective said. Our investigation has revealed that David's associates are not small-time criminals. They're connected to organized crime syndicates involved in interstate gambling operations, money laundering, and other serious federal crimes. The dogfighting ring was just one element of a larger criminal network. Has Emma witnessed anything that would make her a target? Sarah asked urgently. Are there people who might try to? No, Detective assured her quickly. Emma's involvement is limited to her identification of the dog. We're providing witness protection services, but not because Emma is in danger. Rather, as a precaution, we want to ensure that organized crime associates can't use her to pressure David or gather information. You and Emma will have resources available to you indefinitely. What about David? Sarah asked. What will happen to him? David is facing federal charges, Detective said. Animal cruelty under federal law carries sentences up to 10 years. Money laundering, fraud, gambling operation charges, and conspiracy charges will add substantially to his sentence. The prosecutors are estimating he could face 20 to 30 years in federal prison. His cooperation in providing information about his criminal associates may reduce his sentence, but he's not going anywhere. Sarah sank back into her chair. Relief and anger warred within her. David would be imprisoned. Emma was safe. But the betrayal cut deep. This was the man she'd once loved, once believed she would build a life with. This was Emma's biological father. The man had been involved in systematic animal cruelty, organized crime, money laundering, and had been planning to use his own daughter as an escape tool. I want you to know something, Doctor said gently. Emma's bravery today, her memory, her identification of the dog, has resulted in the rescue of 23 animals. Most of them will recover with proper care. The facility will be permanently shut down. David's associates are facing serious charges. Emma has inadvertently done something extraordinary. She doesn't understand that, Sarah said quietly. She's 3 years old. She just knew that Max was familiar and said what she remembered. That's what makes it so remarkable, Detective said. She wasn't trying to be brave. She was just being honest about what she knew, and that honesty has changed everything. Over the next several weeks, More details emerged through court documents and investigative reports that Sarah gradually accessed through her attorney. She learned that David had inherited money from his mother's death 8 months earlier, money that had funded his criminal enterprise. She learned that he'd been recruiting other individuals into the operation, planning to expand it significantly. She learned that her ex-husband was not the man she'd thought she knew. He was a criminal, a liar, and someone capable of extraordinary cruelty to both animals and his own child. But she also learned something about Emma, about her daughter's remarkable memory, her intuitive recognition of wrongness, and her ability to communicate truth despite her age. Emma had unwittingly become an instrument of justice. Sarah held her daughter close as they left the police station for the last time, Emma's small hand trustingly wrapped in her mother's. The nightmare wasn't completely over. There would be court proceedings, testimony, the slow process of prosecution. But the custody battle was gone. David's threat was neutralized. And most importantly, Emma was safe. "You did good, baby," Sarah whispered to her daughter. "You helped the dogs, you helped other children, and you came home safe to Mommy. That's all that matters now." Emma looked up at her mother with those impossibly bright eyes and smiled, completely unaware of the magnitude of what her simple words had accomplished. 6 months had passed since that day in Judge Henderson's courtroom when everything changed. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the courthouse as Sarah sat in the gallery, her hand resting protectively on Emma's small shoulders. Today was different from their last visit. This time, they were coming for closure, for justice, for vindication. This time, they were coming to reclaim their lives. Emma wore a white dress with small flowers embroidered at the collar, and her curls had been carefully brushed. She understood, at her limited 3-year-old capacity, that today was important. She was holding a stuffed rabbit, not her old one, but a new one that Officer Torres had given her as a gift. The rabbit was a comfort object, something to ground her in the courtroom that had once terrified her. Sat beside Sarah, her briefcase containing documents and evidence for what would be the final hearing. The custody case had been dismissed weeks ago, but today's proceeding was something else entirely. Today, they were here to ensure that the truth was officially recorded, that Sarah's vindication was complete, and that Emma's testimony was formally recognized and protected. Judge Henderson entered the courtroom and everyone stood. The judge looked different today, not stern and cold, but thoughtful and measured. She'd spent the past 6 months reviewing the investigation files, reading the psychological evaluations of Emma, and understanding the profound injustice of what had nearly occurred. She'd presided over preliminary hearings in David's criminal case, and she'd witnessed the systematic exposure of his crimes. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Henderson began, addressing Sarah directly, something she hadn't done during the custody proceedings. "I want to personally apologize. During the custody hearing in November, I made judgments based on incomplete information. I perceived a distressed child and an anxious mother, and I allowed those perceptions to cloud my judicial responsibilities. I now understand that your anxiety was justified, that your daughter's distress was a response to genuine danger, and that you had been correct to protect her from her father's influence." Sarah felt tears begin to stream down her face. It wasn't just an apology. It was an acknowledgement that the system itself had nearly failed them, and that the judge was willing to admit that failure. "Today," Judge Henderson continued, "I'm formally issuing an order restoring your full and sole custody of Emma Mitchell. Additionally, I'm recommending that your ex-husband never be allowed unsupervised contact with your daughter, and that any future contact be subject to supervision by licensed professionals and law enforcement. This order will remain in effect until Emma reaches the age of majority and can make her own decisions about any relationship with her father." The gavel came down, and it felt like the weight of the world lifting from Sarah's shoulders. She pulled Emma close, and her daughter wrapped her small arms around her mother's neck. "We can go home now," Emma asked innocently. "We can go home," Sarah confirmed, tears flowing freely. We're going home and we're never leaving again. You're safe, you're mine, and nobody can ever take you away. The courtroom was nearly empty except for Sarah and Emma, but behind the one-way glass of the observation area, there were others present. Officer James Torres stood with his police dog Max, who had been officially commended by the department for his role in the case, though of course the dog had simply been doing what he was trained to do. Beside Torres stood several federal agents who had worked the case, along with representatives from multiple animal welfare organizations. As Sarah and Emma exited the courtroom, Torres met them in the hallway. "Ms. Mitchell," he said warmly, extending his hand, "I wanted to see this resolved. You've both been incredibly strong through this process." "Thank you," Sarah said, gripping his hand firmly. "If it weren't for you and Max—" She couldn't finish the sentence, overwhelmed by gratitude. "I just brought the dog," Torres said humbly. "Emma did the rest. She told the truth, and that truth changed everything." As if on cue, Emma spotted Max and her face lit up with pure delight. The little girl ran to the dog, a movement that had once terrified her mother in the courtroom, but now brought only joy. Emma hugged Max's neck, and the dog responded with gentle patience, his tail wagging steadily. "Max wants to say goodbye," Torres explained. "I'm being transferred to the federal K-9 unit next month. Max and I will be working on cases across the Pacific Northwest, but I wanted him to see Emma one more time, to remind him of the good work he did." As if the dog understood, Max leaned against Emma, giving her his full weight. The child held the dog, completely at peace, completely safe. This was the moment Emma would remember as an adult, not the fear in the courtroom, but the comfort of this dog, the gentle strength of Officer Torres, and her mother's unwavering love. 3 hours later, Sarah and Emma were home in their small apartment. Sarah had made Emma's favorite lunch, turkey sandwiches with the crusts cut off, apple slices, and a juice box. They sat at their small kitchen table, and Sarah watched her daughter eat with gratitude that bordered on spiritual. "Mommy," Emma said through a mouthful of sandwich, "is Daddy going away?" Sarah had been preparing for this question, discussing with Doctor the best way to explain David's absence to her daughter. "Yes, baby. Daddy did bad things and now he has to go away for a very long time. But that's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. You were very brave and told the truth, and that's why Daddy has to go away, to keep other people safe." "Like the dogs?" Emma asked, demonstrating her 3-year-old understanding of cause and effect. "Exactly like the dogs," Sarah confirmed. "You helped the dogs by telling the truth, and now the dogs are safe and you're safe and we're going to be together forever." Emma nodded, satisfied with this explanation, and returned to her sandwich. Children, Sarah had learned, could be remarkably resilient when they had love and stability to anchor them. That evening, Sarah received a call from Doctor. "I wanted to let you know," the psychologist said, "that I've been contacted by several national news organizations wanting to do stories about Emma's role in the case. The story of a 3-year-old identifying a dog-fighting operation has captured national attention. People want to know about the brave child who changed everything." "I don't want Emma exploited," Sarah said immediately. "She's still processing everything. She needs normalcy and privacy." "I understand completely," Doctor said. "I've declined all requests for Emma's identification or interviews. What I wanted to tell you is that the publicity around this case has actually sparked a national conversation about animal welfare, about organized crime, and about trusting children's testimony. Emma's story, without revealing her identity, is helping to change policy and raise awareness. Your daughter has inadvertently become a voice for the voiceless." After the call, Sarah stood at Emma's bedroom door, watching her daughter sleep. Emma was curled up with her stuffed rabbit, the one Torres had given her. Her face was peaceful, innocent, untouched by the trauma she'd endured and the justice she'd inadvertently created. Sarah made a silent promise to her sleeping daughter. She would spend the rest of her life protecting this child, nurturing her, ensuring she never again came close to danger. She would tell Emma the truth when she was old enough to understand it, about her father's crimes, about her own bravery, about how her simple words had changed the world for 23 suffering animals and prevented her own father from using her as a tool for criminal escape. But for now, Emma was simply a little girl, safe in her mother's home, loved beyond measure, sleeping the peaceful sleep of a child who finally understood that she was truly, completely protected. 2 weeks later, federal prosecutors secured guilty pleas from David and 7 of his associates. The sentencing hearing would come later, but the verdict was certain. David would spend decades in federal prison. The dog-fighting operation was dismantled. 23 dogs received rehabilitation and found new homes. The organized crime network connected to the operation was disrupted, with multiple members facing federal charges. And it had all begun with a 3-year-old girl pointing at a dog and saying 2 simple words. As winter turned to spring in Portland, Sarah and Emma settled into their new normal. Sarah continued working as a pediatric nurse, but with increased confidence and joy. Emma thrived in preschool, a happy, secure child who'd survived something she would barely remember but whose effects would ripple outward for years to come. One morning in May, as Sarah was doing dishes, Emma ran to her with a drawing she'd made at preschool. It was a picture of a dog and a little girl, holding hands, or rather hand and paw. "That's Max and me," Emma said proudly. "Teacher asked what made me happy, and I drew Max and you in our home." Sarah knelt down and embraced her daughter, breathing in the sweet toddler scent of her hair, feeling the warm weight of her small body in her arms. This moment, this simple, ordinary, precious moment, was worth every hardship, every fear, every dark moment of the custody battle. Emma had survived. They'd both survived. And they'd emerged not broken, but stronger, bonded by the knowledge that their love for each other could weather any storm. In a way, Officer Torres had been right. Emma's simple truth had changed everything. But more than that, it had saved them both.